Good morning, everyone, or afternoon, depending on what area you are joining us from. We are going to go ahead and get started with our webinar today. We do expect a lot of people to kind of join in as we start our conversations today. Again, the webinar will be uploaded to the CALCASA site within the next couple of days. It will be recorded, so you can have access to that as well if you miss any parts of the webinar today. Before we get started, there are a few housekeeping items to review. Again, the webinar will be recorded and uploaded to the CALCASA site. All participants will be muted. To avoid any unwanted noise, we do encourage you to mute your own devices. Please feel free to type all questions and or comments in the chat box. We will be monitoring the chat box and respond to any of these questions as they go through, or we might even try to respond to answer the questions via the slides that are coming in the presentation. The webinar was developed as a resource for advocates and others to ensure that all survivors in detention have access to advocacy via rape crisis centers. If you're joining us from the state of California, from other places that might not have a rape crisis center, closely related services via other community resources as well. So please enjoy. Even though several of the points of this webinar can apply to all forms of detention, the Advancing Prea project, which is what we are funded under, keeps many of the protocol and procedures conversations very specific to the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation Facilities. We do want to share that a lot of these best practices and a lot of these kind of process in forensic exams do apply to all forms of detention. So welcome to Accompanying Incarcerated Survivors at Forensic Exams. My name is Juliana Baez, Program Coordinator for the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault, or CALCASA, and I would like to welcome Kris Mady and Matthew VanWinkle, both Senior Program Officers at Just Detention International, or JDI, whom I will be co-presenting today. And Matthew and Kris, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great.
Thank you for the introduction. Welcome, everyone.
Yes.
Welcome.
A little bit about the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault. We do represent over 80 rape crisis centers in the state of California and other member agencies. CALCASA is committed to ending sexual violence through a multifaceted approach of prevention, intervention, education, research, advocacy, and public policy. CALCASA provides leadership, vision, and resources to rape crisis centers, individuals, and other entities committed to ending sexual violence. CALCASA truly envisions a world free from sexual violence.
And Just Detention International, or JDI for short, is a health and human rights organization that seeks to end sexual abuse in all forms of detention. It's JDI's belief that when the government takes away someone's freedom, it takes on an absolute responsibility to protect that person's safety. So no matter what crime someone has committed, rape is not part of the penalty. And we're speaking to you today as part of the California Advancing Prea project, which is funded by the California Office of Emergency Services. This project allows CALCASA and JDI to partner in offering support and guidance to California rape crisis centers on how to build strong relationships with the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation Facilities. And we provide a lot of training and technical assistance around the state in California. As Juliana mentioned, a lot of the content today is going to be nationally relevant, not only specific to California. So we're very happy to have guests. If you may be listening from a state other than California, you can go ahead and type your state in the chat box. We'd love to say hello to you. Welcome. We will try to answer any and all questions you might have. And if we aren't able to answer the question, if it's relevant specifically to your state, New York, Oregon, welcome, welcome. If we're not able to answer your question specifically during the webinar, we will certainly follow up with you later. So you can see on your screen, this is our agenda for today. We'll start by discussing Prea and forensic exams. Prea, as you know or may not know, is the Prison Rape Elimination Act. We'll continue into best practices for providing accompaniment. West Virginia, Washington, welcome. Oh, Clarion, Pennsylvania, very nearby where I grew up. Georgia, welcome. We'll continue into best practices for providing forensic accompaniment to incarcerated survivors at forensic exams. And then we'll conclude with a discussion of release of information and follow-up services. Wisconsin, welcome. Nebraska. So we want to encourage you all to please practice self-care during the webinar. As Juliana mentioned, it is going to be recorded. So if you need to step away, of course, that's fine. Stand up, stretch, do any activity that will help you be aware of yourself. I believe that there were coloring pages that were sent out to you along with the invitations. So please feel free to doodle or color, just anything you need to do to take care of yourself and feel like you're taking care of yourself. We encourage that. So Prea, as I mentioned, is an acronym for the Prison Rape Elimination Act, which was signed into law in 2003. If you're not familiar, Prea puts the responsibility squarely on detention facilities to prevent, detect, and respond to sexual abuse and sexual harassment inside to keep people safe once they've lost their freedom. The Prea standards, of which there are 52, and they are quite detailed, they were released in 2012, and they lay out the means whereby detention facilities are to the best practices that they must follow in order to keep folks safe while they do their time. Today we're going to be dealing specifically with the forensic exam accompaniment piece of the Prea standards. So one of the goals of Prea is to ensure that survivors who are incarcerated receive a level of care that is as close as possible to what's available to those in the outside community. And this includes accompaniment by an advocate during forensic exams following sexual assault. However, the way the law is worded may actually undermine that stated goal of making sure that all survivors can receive that support. So let's take a look at what Prea actually says. In Prea Standard 115.21, Evidence Protocol and Forensic Medical Examinations. It says that the agency, that's the correctional facility, shall attempt to make available to the victim a victim advocate from a rape crisis center. If a rape crisis center is not available to provide victim advocate services, the agency shall make available to provide these services a qualified staff member from a community-based agency or a qualified agency staff member. And again, agency here means the correctional facility. So does anyone have any thoughts about the particular wording of this section of the Prea law? You can go ahead and type in the chat box if you do. If it brings anything up for you. Yep. It's a little vague, it's a little open-ended. Yes, I think the thing that we're looking at here is that although the intent, qualified agency staff member, although the intent is to make sure that it's a victim advocate from a rape crisis center, it also allows, again, very vague, it also allows for a little bit of a possibility that someone might kind of sidestep there's a conflict of interest there. It allows corrections facilities to sidestep the victim advocate if they can find someone that they deem to be qualified, and we're going to use that word, kind of in quotes, if they can find someone even on their own staff who might be able to provide accompaniment. Exactly. Not the same level of confidentiality that rape crisis counselors would have. If it would be someone on their staff, that person would obviously be a mandated reporter, and they would be taking any information that they got from the survivor or any statement and running with it to the investigative team, even if it wasn't the survivor's wish. Right, exactly. Qualified is not really defined here. And that's an interesting comment up above. You were told by the prison investigator, in your case, what happens in prison stays in prison. It's interesting. Yes, it is very vague. The person that is deemed qualified by the correctional facility may not be trained in the way that a victim advocate from a rape crisis center is. They may not have a trauma-informed lens. In the event that it is staff-perpetrated sexual assault, that would make that person a colleague of the perpetrator. Yes, and not available is not really defined either. It doesn't really lay out the steps that they need to take to make sure that they yeah, these are great comments. So I think we just want to be aware of, even though Prea is a very, very strong law, and it's certainly the best thing we have, in terms of the forensic exam accompaniment, there is a little bit of daylight between what we would hope to see as best practice, which is always kind of making sure that a victim advocate is included in that conversation so that they can talk about their services with the survivor, discuss their role, make sure that it's known that they're not a staff of the facility, that they're a totally separate agency that holds confidentiality. So this really speaks to the need for strong partnership and preparation and coordination between rape crisis centers and their local facilities. So moving on, we just read D. Now we're moving into E. As requested by the victim advocate, qualified agency staff member, or qualified community-based organization staff member shall accompany and support the victim through the forensic medical examination process and investigatory interviews, and shall provide emotional support, crisis intervention, information, and referrals. So here on this slide, we've highlighted the phrase as requested by the victim. And I think that we want to highlight that as another barrier that survivors face in obtaining the support of forensic accompaniment during that time. First of all, if a survivor does not know that they can request it, they are not likely to make such a request. This is something that we see as an area in which the comprehensive education that inmates are provided with when they enter a facility is a little less than what it should be. This is not something that is typically hit very hard when folks are being told about what Prea is and what their rights are. These are great questions. I will make sure that we will definitely look into some of these state-specific questions and follow up with you later. I do want to just say that this is where we see if it's left to the corrections first responders to let the survivor know about their option and right to having a victim advocate provide support, then that first responder, that CO or deputy, he or she may not be messaging correctly about the services. And it may be unclear to the survivor that the rape crisis agency is totally separate and not just someone that they're calling from another part of the facility to come and make sure that person has someone in the room just for them, to hold their confidentiality and just to be there to advocate and support for them. So yes, in the best possible scenario, every person held in detention will have received information about rape crisis services such as your agencies provide, and that your accompaniment during a forensic exam and interviews is part of their right under Prea. But unfortunately, we know that that's not always the case. So we do, and we're going to get into best practices later, but we do certainly recommend, that's another great argument for having a coordinated response team, or making sure that your facilities are involved in the local community SART. When you meet regularly, you have a more clear understanding of each other's roles. You know what will happen in the aftermath of an assault. And we can make sure in that way that the messaging for survivors about their rights to accompaniment will be more clearly and accurately stated. If all possible staff first responders know that their first duty is to call your agency, that's even better, so that a victim advocate from your agency can be present to explain in person what you do and how you can help the survivor face to face. And then of course they can decline it, but at least you know that it's not for lack of proper messaging that they're declining it. These are great comments, and as I said, we will follow up with you about some of your state-specific questions.
Thank you, Matthew. And now that we've identified some of those Prea standards related to the forensic exams, I want to talk a little bit more about what we do have within our control so that we can make forensic exam accompaniment as helpful as it can be for survivors who are incarcerated. I always like to keep this in mind before going into a forensic exam, because I think we might feel like we don't have control over a lot of pieces, or maybe we're not doing enough. And so as Maddie, a rape crisis counselor, stated, even if you can't do anything tangible for a survivor during a forensic exam, just being there and treating that person as a human being will make a huge difference. So this is just a good thing to keep in mind as we talk about what you can do while you're in that exam with somebody. But before we get to the exam, really looking at some things that we can do to prepare can be really, really helpful. So while it's best practice that a facility takes a survivor to receive a sexual assault forensic exam, if they're within that 120-hour window, some places consult with their medical staff or maybe with officers who are not trained in forensic nursing to decide if an exam is needed or not. So it's really best practice for a facility to work directly with a forensic nurse if they're unsure if they should transport a survivor to an exam or not. And as advocates, we can work with our facilities on coordinated response plans to encourage them to follow this best practice and encourage them to really be talking to forensic nurses rather than trying to do it in-house. You can also make sure that you're reviewing a facility's coordinated response plan to make sure contacting your agency for an accompaniment is included as part of this plan. So what some rape crisis centers have done is help create first responder pocket cards for prison staff at their facility that help outline these pieces so staff has a quick reference, and that your number is included on that plan, on that card. So make sure you're checking in with your Prea compliance manager or other contact at your facility about how you're going to be contacted if a survivor needs to have an exam done. It's also important that you're thinking about the timing on that. Some places request an hour's notice so that they can respond in a timely manner. So make sure that's part of that response plan. Before an exam comes up, you'll also want to determine where your facilities are taking survivors to get exams. So for some, it's going to be a local hospital that the prison or jail has a contract with. But in some rare cases, the prison may transport a survivor to a hospital that's outside of your service area. So this is a reason to make sure you're aware of procedures so that you can ensure that your client receives care from the corresponding rape crisis center. We'll talk a little bit more about this later when we discuss releases of information and why they're so important. At other prisons, the exams are done on-site at the facility. If this is the case, make sure that your staff have clearance to enter the facility so that you can accompany a survivor during that forensic exam. It's helpful to have as much information as possible as you can upfront so that you can help educate survivors who may call your hotline and have questions around this process, and also so you can prepare your advocates who will be responding. As a sexual assault that leads to a forensic exam can be a chaotic point for a facility, what some rape crisis centers have done is help their facility by doing a test run of the whole process so that everyone feels prepared and knows what to expect. For our California advocates today, we want to briefly highlight facilities that do forensic exams on site. So the 4 CDCR facilities that have the medical capabilities to do this are CCI, CAC, LAC, and CMF. If you're working with one of these facilities, make sure that your advocates, again, have those clearances to go in so that they can accompany survivors for these exams. So as we all know, training is incredibly important before we do anything as an advocate. So make sure that any advocate who might accompany incarcerated clients to a forensic exam is trained on best practices around that and the procedural differences that will come about. It's going to be important that advocates understand how the reporting process and investigations may be different than what they're used to for survivors in the community, so that they can help explain what this may look like to a survivor during an exam. Training might also be relevant for forensic nurses. So just like many of our advocates may have no experience working with folks who are incarcerated, our nurses may also be in a similar position. So this can be an opportunity to make sure that everyone's on the same page about best practices and providing the most trauma-informed care that we can during these exams. So what do forensic exams look like for folks who are incarcerated? So when you get there, what does that actually look like? So generally, a survivor will be taken to an exam site in a transport vehicle accompanied by 2 officers. Many times, the officers who accompany a survivor to a sexual assault forensic exam have never been to one of these exams before, and they may not know what it entails. When you arrive to the hospital, you may find that your survivor is in handcuffs, waist chains, ankle cuffs, as well as in their CDCR or other prison uniform. So if possible, when you meet a survivor in the waiting room, especially if your waiting room is busy or has other folks in it, it can be really helpful to get that survivor seated comfortably and get them a blanket so that they can cover their shackles. This allows the survivor to have a little bit more privacy. And it looks like a couple of you have accompanied folks to forensic exams. If you don't mind writing in the chat box, if anyone has accompanied someone who has been incarcerated to a forensic exam, we'd love to sort of get a raise of hands. Great. Looks like a lot of folks have. That's really great. All right. So once you arrive at a forensic exam, you want to make sure that everyone there is on the same page. And as we all know, sometimes that can be difficult to do. So it's always best practice to not only introduce yourself to the survivor, but also to any officers present and the nurse, so everyone has an understanding of who you are and your right to be there with the survivor. So officers may be wary of your presence, and if needed, you can cite the Prea standards and your facility's coordinated response plan to help back up your right to be there with the survivor during that forensic exam. Just like with survivors in the community, you will also want to explain to the survivor who you are and what your role is. Even if someone has already explained your role to the survivor, it is always best practice to do it yourself. The best person to explain the benefit of an advocate is the advocate. You can let the survivor know what you do and that your organization is separate from the prison, that you are an outside person, that you're just there for them and to help them through this process. You want to be very clear about the limits on your confidentiality up front, so no one feels like you are lying to them or that you're breaching anyone's trust. Although, as Matthew stated, folks who are incarcerated do receive a basic Prea education when they enter a facility and a more comprehensive education if they've been there for more than 30 days, it generally does not cover what an exam would look like. So you may also want to explain briefly what a forensic exam looks like, so they have an idea if the nurse hasn't already explained that to them. As always, you want to let the survivor know that you can be there for the entirety of the exam or just pieces of it, or that you can wait to talk to them once the exam itself is over. Let them know that they are in control about you being in the room or not. It is best practice that even if the survivor does not want you in that exam room during the exam, that you wait in case they change their mind, and so you can check in with them once the exam is over. Not only does a survivor have control over whether or not you're in the room with them, they also get to decide what pieces of the exam they do and do not want to do. Like with all survivors, during the exam, the more power you can give someone over their decisions, the better. When someone is incarcerated, there may be more pressure from a nurse or the officers for that person to do or not do parts of an exam, or to give pieces of information that they may not feel comfortable giving. There is no reason that a survivor should ever be forced to do any piece of an exam that they are not comfortable with. They still remain autonomous over what they want to do and do not want to do during the exam. It's very important that you remind them of this and help advocate for them if anyone is pushing them to do pieces that they do not want to do, including giving information about perpetrators. So as folks have brought up before, confidentiality is incredibly important with our work for survivors. With clients who are incarcerated, we sometimes have to be creative about creating a sense of privacy and maintaining confidentiality. It's likely that at least one officer will have to remain at least within eyesight of the survivor. So this means that you will not have the same level of privacy that you normally do during these forensic exams. That being said, your conversation with survivors are still confidential. What a survivor shares with you, excluding child abuse and imminent threats to self or others, is protected information and should not be shared without a release of information. Remember that you're there for the survivor. So just like when family members or friends who are in an exam room with you, when you're with survivors who are from the community, your primary concern is always the survivor, not the other folks. This is the same case when working with someone who is incarcerated. So officers might ask you questions or want you to tell them something that the survivor told you, but you can always politely remind that officer that what the survivor tells you is confidential and that you're not able to share that information. So when we get started on that exam, again, always remember to introduce yourself to everyone. You want to make sure the survivor, the nurse, and the officers know who you are and that you're the advocate. When you're working with any survivor in a medical setting, you always want to make sure that you're using a name that feels most comfortable to that person, as they will often only have someone's legal name or perhaps their last name. Officers may only use that person's last name or even an ID number to refer to that person. So make sure you're actually referring to them how they want to be called. Make sure you address the survivor using the name that feels most comfortable to them, even if others are even using different names for them. It's also always best practice to ask what pronouns your clients use and make sure that you're using correct pronouns for your client throughout the exam. In thinking about where you sit, if the survivor wants you in that room, it's always helpful to see where you can be for that person while still giving them the privacy that they deserve. So if possible, and as always with the consent of the survivor, a good place to sit is by their side, up by their head, if they're on an exam table. That allows you to have a closer conversation with them, and it also allows the person to have more privacy if a genital exam is done while you're in the room. It looks like one of our participants tried to have their SART exams done in glass-walled rooms so officers can see what's happening. That's really fantastic that that's sort of been brought up as conversation. We're not seeing that in a lot of facilities, but that is nice that that it's been brought up and it's been part of a conversation. Unfortunately, we don't have the power as advocates to ask them to completely leave the room. At the end of the day, the officers really do get to make that final decision if they feel like they need to be in the room or not. But thank you for sharing that. So again, once you're in that exam with somebody, just like with any survivor, we probably are going to talk about a wide variety of things with our survivor and perhaps with the nurse as well. So your main role as an advocate is to believe the survivor and to continually remind them that it's not their fault what happened to them. So this is especially important for someone who's incarcerated, as there's often an added layer of blame or acceptance towards sexual violence behind bars. You will always want to be there to explain things that perhaps the nurse is doing, especially if that survivor seems confused. So while we know that doing an exam on someone who is handcuffed and shackles on them is not trauma-informed, as advocates, we do not have the authority to ask them to be moved or removed. And this can be incredibly hard for us to kind of sit with as advocates. So the nurse may ask for them to be removed, and they will have to ask the officers directly if they need to do this for their exam properly. But unfortunately, we cannot ask for those handcuffs or ankle chains to be removed. So you can also help a survivor understand the investigative and reporting process. And this is why it's so important that you know how this can look different than it does for someone who reported sexual abuse in the community. We all know that exams can be long and can be an incredibly difficult process to get through. And so you might end up talking about things with the survivor that are not directly related to the assault, perhaps like the survivor's family or places that make them feel safest, or you might just talk about media. So one thing that you should not engage in conversation about or ever ask is why the survivor you're working with is incarcerated. Knowing why someone is incarcerated may make you biased against that person or treat them differently. If there are safety risks that you need to know, an officer will let you know upfront, but knowing why someone is in prison or in jail is not necessary for you to serve them during a forensic exam. A survivor might end up telling you, or an officer may tell you, but it's important to remind them that you're there because of what just happened to them, and that you're there to help them in their healing process, that no one, no matter what crime they may have committed, deserves to be assaulted. So we got a question here, is why advocates can't ask if restraints can be removed. So unfortunately, it's more the fact that we don't have any backup like through Prea or through other laws to ask for that. And officers really have the final say in that. So we don't really have any, again, we don't have that like kind of basis of law to ask for them to be removed. So to move on to sort of some of these difficult conversations we may have during an exam process, even if we're having a positive interaction with a survivor, sometimes officers or nurses may say things that we don't agree with or are problematic. So it's always important for us to be professional and maintain our relationships with both nurses and facility staff, but you also want to make sure you're stepping up and make sure that any problematic language is addressed up front. So sometimes an officer may try to invalidate a survivor's story. Remember that you're not there as an investigator and that you're there for the survivor. And you can remind an officer this and of your role. So just like it is necessary to educate your advocates on working with incarcerated survivors, the nurses you work with, again, may not have worked with someone who's currently incarcerated and may benefit from training as well. So while it's not appropriate during an exam to give education on this, you may have to do some bias control. During an exam, you might also find out that a process or procedure was not followed correctly at the facility that the survivor came from. So for example, the survivor may disclose that they tried to report the assault, but the officer that they first reported to didn't take that report. In this case, with a survivor's permission, you may want to follow up with your Prea compliance manager or other contact at the facility about this. So but make sure you're documenting these different things so that you can follow up with the facility with the survivor's consent. Sometimes survivors are transported to a different facility after an exam. If this is the case, it's going to be important for you to get this information so you can help the survivor identify next steps and safety plan. So to get this information, you may have to be very clear with the officers that you need this information to do the work that you're there for. And I think this really nicely leads us to what Juliana is going to open it up to, is talking about following up with a client after a forensic exam and kind of guiding those next steps with that person. Juliana?
Thank you, Kris. And I wanted to say that we are very, very, I lost my train of thought there, but we encourage you to keep typing in your comments and your questions. And if we don't have an opportunity to discuss them as we're going through the webinar, we'll definitely, just like Matthew mentioned, go back and definitely provide that one-on-one conversation. I see that a lot of you are definitely sharing with us a little bit more about bias, right? About bias control. And I think that that is an important conversation that we need to have constantly, not only when it comes to the biases that might come directly from staff from the facility, but within our own agencies, right? We start changing these systems within our agencies as well. So thank you for sharing your own biases and your own experiences with that, because in order to really start eliminating these, we need to put them out there and talk about them. So we encourage you to keep typing and keep sharing with each other. This is a very specific community in the work that we're doing. So as you know, connect with each other, talk to each other, share with each other your experiences as well. And you know, again, type in your questions and we'll respond them as we're going if we have an opportunity to do so. Thank you, Kris, and thank you, Matthew, for all the information and all the background and foundation that you've developed. So my conversation or my follow-up is going to be more focused on what happens right after you've been there and did the forensic exam, you've advocated, you've shared your role with the survivor, and you might have shared your role already with the facility or the transport officers, which are typically not the ones that you're constantly being in contact with. We know that although the trauma-informed advocacy of supporting an incarcerated survivor during an exam is very similar to the way that you would provide advocacy to survivors outside of confinement, there are some things that you have to consider and that may look and they might even feel different from the process that you do with survivors in the free world, especially when it comes to follow-up services. The approach of rape crisis centers is definitely one that ensures and offers follow-up services to all survivors in the most accessible way possible. Typically, if a survivor would like follow-up services, they're given a list of resources, including the rape crisis centers or the victim service agencies information, and they typically get a call within a few business days. Realistically, we know that this cannot happen the same way when we are providing advocacy to someone who's incarcerated. So we typically ask them to sign and inform them of a consent form or release of information or a ROI, which some of us call it, which is not typically the same as the way that it would look for someone who's outside. The conversation at the exam site might look a little bit different again from that one that you've had with someone who's out in the community to ensure that they have access to follow-up services. And a lot of the times this happens, the first interaction after a forensic exam might even happen via written correspondence so that we can provide as confidential as possible support. And like in the community, and like I mentioned prior, you can also offer your contact information for the survivor to take with them. Just like Kris mentioned before, you would develop something specific for someone who's incarcerated. You can provide some sort of literature or some sort of printed material that might be appropriate for the survivor to take back to the facility, something that the facility approves, and one of the things that we encourage is also to check in with the community of inmates to ensure that what you are providing is something that they also feel comfortable in having access to. We always encourage all of you to check in with the inmate councils that they have in facilities. In California, I know they do that. I'm just going to assume that in most facilities in other states, they have something similar where they're typically inmates who are the liaison between the community of inmates and the community of staff and others to ensure that what you're going to provide to them is something that they feel comfortable in accessing as well. And just to kind of keep going on the release of information, we know that this is also a very important protective measure that goes hand in hand in empowering the survivor to have some sort of control over the way that they would like to receive these victim services. Again, we're going back to empowering the survivor. So in this section, we're going to talk a little bit about how to best tailor your agency's release of information to be the most helpful to a client in detention. And we're going to go over some of the follow-up services mentioned by Prea, which assigned a release of information might provide more access to. If your survivor wants you to advocate on their behalf or to reach out to the facility to set up a follow-up services for them, you will want to have and complete a release of information. An example of a release of information is here, and this one was developed actually by Kris when they were in their previous agency. So this is a really good template and example, and we can definitely forward you the template to look at it, so you can develop your own as well. We always encourage that, be sure to let the survivor know that the risk that they might be involved if you do some advocacy on their behalf. Make share with them the realistic expectations of this. You are going to have to reach out and, provide their name and their CDCR number. So there's going to be other people that are going to know their information. So even though you provide confidential information on a one-on-one basis. The process of being able to provide this might not be as confidential as possible. We always like to frame things by using the word we should, or the word should instead of I will, and saying things from, and follow-up services of the facility. So you don't want to promise things. You want to say that you will try to do things. It's not something that you're going to do or you should be expecting to do this. You might also want to let them know that some survivors find that with increased attention that they might face, some retaliation as well. So you want to make sure that you are thinking about how you're going to provide these follow-up services and how you're going to reach out to the survivor and what is the process that you're going to take as you're reaching out to the survivor so that you ensure that retaliation is not, again, you can't ensure that, but that the possibility of retaliation doesn't occur and that, the survivor feels empowered and safe in really talking about what happened. And as prisoners are often transferred to different facilities within the system, it is also important to be aware that rape crisis centers other rape crisis centers within other facilities are also available. One of the things that we suggest is that you do put in your release of information that they consent for you to give information to other rape crisis centers so that services do not stop because they are being transferred to other facilities. We want to ensure that they continue receiving support, emotional support especially. So connect with your rape crisis centers around the area, connect with those that might be providing services to your facilities, so that way you ensure that your survivor continues to receive these things. Again, we know that it's very typical in detention for them to be transferred from one place to another. So the more that we can do to ensure that they receive this continuous support, the more that we're going to be able to advocate for their needs. Again, if you have any questions or any comments, please keep typing them in the chat box. I know that Kris and Matthew are taking a look at them as well. So if I don't respond to them as I'm talking, they might be able to do so as well. So let's talk about some of the benefits and items to keep in mind when we have a release of information completed during a forensic exam. When you're having a survivor complete a release of information, you always want to allow space for clients to name specific individuals that they give permission to discuss their situation with. Most of the time, this will be a PCM at the facility if you're trying to set up follow-up services, or an advocate at a neighboring rape crisis center or agency that provides victim services. When filling out the release of information with your client, make sure that you explain why you're completing the form and what it really means. We always like to offer, the survivor that we can read the release of information out loud and summarize some of the services and summarize it and some of the services that are available so that they really have a clear understanding of what it's available to them. And again, release of information are typically written with heavy legal language, so we want to make sure that everyone understands what they're signing. And many of you have materials and information that have already been developed within your agencies. We encourage you to have these available to give to survivors when after you are done with a forensic exam. And we also encourage you to develop something that is more tailored to survivors in detention. Some of the services that you have available for the survivors outside in the community might not be available within the facility, or might not be within the capacity of your agency. So ensure that you have something that is realistic and then something tailored to their needs as well. Again, these materials should be altered to the work for someone who is incarcerated. It is important to work with the facility to see what a survivor would or will not be able to bring back with them. For example, clothing and hygiene products that are sometimes given to survivors after a forensic exam are usually not allowed within the facility. It is also important to make sure that any information on coping skills are relevant for someone who is behind bars. Anything on how to contact your organization, such as through a hotline, should be specific to the facility as well. And you would want to make sure that your mailing address is there as well. And we actually have a very really nice coping skill list developed by an inmate who was housed at the California Institute for Women. That is available for you all if you all like to have a copy of that. It's a really good start in developing coping skills that are more appropriate for someone who is in detention. Some survivors do not feel comfortable bringing back worksheets or information that clearly identifies them as having worked with a rape crisis center. So what some centers do is to have a Prea-specific business card that has information more discreetly so that they can keep it closer and it's not, something that it's easily recognizable by someone who hasn't had access to a rape crisis center. After an exam, sometimes the survivor is asked to follow up with the doctor for further medication or for follow-up testing dates. When a survivor is in the community, we might work with them on where they can go to get these services. For someone who's incarcerated, we may want to work with the medical staff at their facility to make sure that they're getting access to this needed care. Again, under Prea, they should be allowed this medical care for free post-assault. Under Prea, as an advocate, you're also supposed to be allowed to accompany the survivor for an investigative interview, which is typically what we hear doesn't happen. At the exam, you can let the survivor know that this is an option and that you will want to make sure that you are notified of when this will be happening so that you can provide that accompaniment. Another thing to keep in mind when we're talking about medical staff, being able to and really advocating for them to receive the support, the follow-up medical support. Include them in your CRT meetings, include them in the conversations so that they're also aware of the things that you are, right? Sometimes what happens is, and we've seen it in the chat box, a lot of them just don't know or they haven't received the notice or the information. So make sure that you include them in the conversations so that they are also available and have access to you as an advocate and that you can remind them that this is also something that the survivor has a right to receive. And just like in all our presentations, we include voices of survivors in every training. Here we see the powerful words of Kendall as a reminder of the physical, emotional, psychological trauma, as well as medical dangers that follow after being raped. I did not want to go to the infirmary because I was still so ashamed about what happened to me, but I had to. They gave me a test, and that's when I got the devastating news. I was HIV positive. Fighting for my life now it was a full-time job. They took my life, but they didn't take the ability to live my life. Every day I wake up and I'm so grateful that I'm still here. So it really talks about the importance of getting that medical support after an assault in order to make sure that they continue living, or they begin their health, really just begin their healing process. And especially when something as impactful as this in your life has, that they continue receiving that support. So figuring out follow-up is an important thing to share with survivors in different ways so that they can stay in contact with your center to continue receiving that care and services even after the exam is over. A goal is always to develop or have developed a good rapport with the survivor so that they would like to continue receiving these services. This is really difficult to do when you're in a forensic exam with a group of people that are constantly, supervising and ensuring that they're not and ensuring their safety of everyone, but they're constantly supervising. So we know the mistrust that happens there. So if they would like to reach out to your center, you would want to make sure that the survivor knows that when they're back at the facility that they can call your hotline by dialing from any phone in the facility, and that will be free, unmonitored, and unrecorded if they are in a CDCR facility. So in the California Department of Correction and Rehabilitation facilities, this is a true thing. And this can happen in other states and other facilities if we advocate for it, where all of our state facilities now have free, unmonitored, and unrecorded connection or calls to the local rape crisis center of the facility. You can also let survivors know that they can reach out to your center via writing, which tends to be the most popular and most confidential as possible way for survivors to reach out to rape crisis centers. In CDCR prisons or prisoners are allowed to use the confidential mail by putting evidence code 1035.4 on the outside envelope. So again, this mail will be treated for California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation as legal mail, where I mean, it's culture. It's part of the culture of corrections that it will be open and look for contraband, but it should not be read just like legal mail. So, make sure that you give your survivor, kind of going back to the follow-up part of it, make sure that you give your survivor your appropriate mailing address. The address, a lot of rape crisis centers in the state of California have a P.O. box. That's typically the best way and more consistent way as well of having survivors reach out, because those typically don't change. And sometimes, agencies move. So, that ensures that continued incapacity. If you offer in-person services, be sure to let the survivor know that they can set up a time and really give them a timeline of what, the expectation of when you think this will happen. Again, it's not as easy as, it's not as accessible as someone in the community. You can't just schedule something for next week. It takes a little bit more than that. So make sure that you let the survivor know that these are some of the timelines or challenges that you might experience in setting something up. Additionally, part of the Prea standards do require that an advocate be allowed to accompany the survivor during an investigative interview. If this is something your organization allows, be sure that you let the survivor know that you can be there during this time as well. So again, is going back to empowering the survivor and giving them all this information so that they know that you are available for them and at different levels or different points of the investigation. This sometimes is something that we also have to discuss with staff and remind them that that's available. Again, we encourage you to meet with them or have a continued conversation with them constantly, or check in with them and remind them that these things are available. So if you are at a place where you're emailing your PCM or your facility or your contact at the facility once or twice a month, make sure that in these emails you remind them of your services and your capacity and what you're available to do as well.
So now we'd like to move into a scenario section, which is a little bit detailed. So we're going to ask you to use your chat boxes to give us your responses and thoughts on the scenario as we read it out slide by slide. And I want to thank you again just for the great comments and questions we've already received. It really is exciting to have such a group of advocates here together virtually with us today. So thank you again for this time. So here's our scenario. You receive a call from the watch commander of a detention facility to provide forensic accompaniment at a hospital to a prisoner who has been raped. When you arrive at the hospital, you see the survivor is wearing only waist chains and a paper gown and appears to be shivering in the cold exam room. The forensic nurse is preparing to begin the exam. 2 armed officers are present in the exam room, standing by. One of the officers tells the survivor to be respectful and cooperate, inmate. This advocate drove from the other side of the county for you. So hearing this scenario, let's identify some of the ways we might start engaging with both the survivor and with the officers. Is there anything that sticks out for anyone? You can go ahead and use the chat box. And Juliana and Kris, feel free to chime in as well. Yep, get them a blanket. That's a big one. It might not be something that you think of as needing in every case, but in this case, it seems like it's definitely needed by the survivor. Yep, you introduce yourself, you explain your role. Let them know that you're happy to support them. Yeah, absolutely. I think that that's right. The officer was speaking on your behalf as a way that, as though you were put out to be there, which is not the foot you want to start on with when you're there to provide that emotional support. Again, advocating for the chains to come off if possible. Let them know that you want to be there. This is very, yep. And you need to clarify with that officer that you will speak for yourself. That's right. And that's a great point too. Once you have the blanket, you ask them if you can put it over them. Yeah, they are in control. Ask if it's okay if you stay after your role is explained. and that you'll be staying there with them through the process. Fantastic. Yeah, ask the survivor their name, because here we can see that the officers are not using their name. Yeah, they're referring to them as inmate. Yeah. Yeah, dehumanizing. Juliana or Kris, do you have any thoughts about this first part of the scenario? We've gotten some great feedback from our... No? Okay. Then we can move on. So as you've requested, thanks to your advocacy, a blanket is brought in for the survivor. One of the officers agrees to withdraw into the hallway, with the other officer taking their post a few feet back from the survivor. You give your name, pronouns, and the name of your agency to the survivor. Thanks for the blanket. You can call me Jay. I use he, him pronouns, the survivor says. The officer at the door snorts and says, he's already lying to you. This is the famous inmate, Josh Marcus. You probably read about his crimes in the paper. So after this development, is there anything that we can think of or that we might do in this scenario? Yep, you continue to call him Jay. That's the way he introduced himself to you. It might be a nickname, yep, or the name that he chooses to use. You could ignore the comment entirely. You thank the officer for stepping out. Yeah, that's true. Thank you, officer, but at the moment, I'm here to speak with Jay. That is very clear, very direct. Thank you, Picky. That's right, Nicole. You're there for the survivor. Yeah, and again, I think what you're seeing here is that the officers are continuing to speak on your behalf in a way that's kind of contrary to your role of centering the survivor. So these are great ways of countering that. Always making sure that they're at the center, using the name that they give you. Yep, you're not here to discuss anything except the harm that's been done and how you can help them. Yeah, that's right. All right, I think we can move along. Thank you.
Sometimes
Kris?
Something that you can do is, that I've done during forensic exams, is instead of turning to the officer and directly addressing what the officer is saying, sometimes you can turn this to the survivor and just let them know that, like a lot of you have already said, that you're not there for anyone but them, and that it doesn't matter what they've done. So you're kind of negating what the officer said without directly confronting what the officer is saying. So that's kind of a nice way of kind of going around it, is just putting those statements towards the positive statements that you have towards the survivor.
Yeah, and also I know that most of you, or all of you really, have experience with even law enforcement being present when there's a forensic exam. They might not be in there as much as someone from a facility, but some of the techniques and some of the language that you use when you're having conversations with law enforcement might also apply to this, right? They're all very militaristic conversations. So that's always something to keep in mind, that you already have the tools to have these conversations with them as well.
Great thoughts, thank you. So again, thanks to your advocacy, the officer agrees to allow you to have an uninterrupted conversation, and the forensic nurse begins the exam as you sit at Jay's shoulder. Jay tells you that 2 days ago he was forced to eat some food by fellow inmates, which was spiked with a sedative. While drugged, he was assaulted multiple times by a fellow inmate who had previously threatened him. Following the assault, the perpetrator forced him to shower. He does not feel safe giving the names of the people who assaulted him, but states that both are gang members. The forensic nurse interrupts to demand that Jay disclose the names of the perpetrators, saying that Jay has to tell her. So not all the trouble is coming from the custody staff here. Let's identify some of the ways we might advocate for the survivor in this new circumstance. That's good, Lauren. It's good that this does not seem like something you would that you would encounter from a nurse. Yeah, but of course, if they did, you would interject that the nurse here is a little out of their lane and being a bit unprofessional. Yep. You tell Jay that they don't have to do or say anything that they don't want to, and that a break can be had. You can let Jay know about his rights. Oh, I'm sorry if there's a little technical difficulty. Karen, maybe you can dial back in. But you're absolutely right. This is correct. The survivor does not need to give any information that he's not comfortable giving, and that he can consent or not consent to any component of the exam. Yeah. Yeah, this is really wonderful. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's an opportunity to educate the nurse as well.
I think another piece to think about with this particular scenario is he just disclosed a lot of awful stuff that just happened to him. So not only do you want to make sure you're addressing the fact that someone's trying to force him to say something that he's not comfortable with, but that he already shared stuff that's incredibly personal and a really awful situation that just happened. So making sure that you're reminding him that what happened to him wasn't his fault, that his reactions make sense given what just happened to him, that you appreciate him sharing what he did share. So just sort of making sure you're addressing that he just shared some really important stuff as well.
Yeah. Thank you, Kris. All right, we can move on. No, Jay, you don't have to disclose information that you don't feel safe sharing, you say, noting the nurse's name to follow up with them and their supervisor at a later time. Thank you, Jay says. This isn't my first assault. I've spent most of my adult life in CDCR prisons. It seems I have a mark on my back. I'm likely to be shipped out again after this. That makes sense, and it's really scary that that's not in your control, you say. With your permission, I can follow up with you in the days ahead and refer you to other agencies like mine if you're transferred. I'll sign any paper that lets me get help, says Jay. So after this scenario, with all this, we've had wonderful comments and thoughts about it. What overall do you think you, the advocate, what did the advocate do right here, beginning to end? And what might you try to keep in mind as you fill out the ROI with Jay? Yep, this advocate did a great job keeping the focus right on the survivor. Mm-hmm. Asking about safety concerns. Mm-hmm. Who does he, yeah. Who is this information being shared with? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Who should be included in that ROI? Yeah, you could talk some of the basics about Prea, why you're there, and that, I guess you've already kind of explained the role. Offer coping skills, things that the survivor can do without anyone's help, such as breathing exercises. Yep. Jacqueline says the practice is to fill out ROIs alone with the survivor to allow for minimal pressure. Yeah, and that's going to be tricky. If you could certainly try to lower your voice, try to keep that focus right, hovered above that piece of paper, and again, like sometimes total privacy is not on the menu, so we have to do the best we can with an imperfect situation. Yeah. Offer that follow-up care. Provide the hotline number. Well, that's good to know, Audrey. Yep, that your agency's hotline can be called in detention facilities, and that it can be a resource if they're having a crisis. Yeah, and obviously, I think it makes sense to in any detention system to kind of have an awareness of if someone is transferred, what they might be looking at in terms of an agency at a possible relocation site. Validate. Yep, that's right, Karen. You validate that feeling of being targeted. Talk about safety planning. Kris or Juliana, did you have any overall thoughts about the way the advocate did their work and the ROI?
No, I think that everyone is really pretty much on, hitting the point of this scenario was that we were able to throw some challenges within the scenario and have the advocate still keep focused on the survivor, right? That's the important part. And a lot of you have that experience in being able to overcome these challenges that you've encountered in a forensic exam, especially when it comes to a survivor who is coming from a detention facility, and ensure that you continue to treat them like human beings, that you continue to empower them so that they, are the ones deciding really what's the next step in this process. One of the things that kind of keep to mind as I'm seeing some of the chat going on is that you're all absolutely right that it might not be, something doable to have them sign this document, right? In the past, we've heard of some advocates who've gotten a verbal consent of information, right? So then when they receive the verbal, they are able to reach out to the facility and set up something where then they have more of a private space to continue the conversation. We've seen that in the past, but all these feelings and all these thoughts and comments are right on to things that have happened, and that might still happen in the future, and that will give you more of that foundation to continue to ensure that you're empowering the survivor to get these follow-up services. Okay. Are we good, Matthew?
Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you for all of your thoughts, your questions, your comments. Again, if we didn't have we're going to spend a little time right now trying to answer some of the questions that you might have, and the ones that we don't get to, we'll definitely take a look at and respond to them at a later time today. Before we get to the questions, we do want to mention that there's a lot of answers to a lot of the questions that you have, or that even that we have sometimes, that can be found on the Prea Resource Center. There are to-go type of thing. They have an amazing FAQ that is very thoroughly thought about. So take a look at the resource. The CALCASA and JDI websites also house a lot of a lot of archived webinars and a lot of tools that can be utilized in really ensuring that not only do you have a foundation or you have resources to ensure the survivors have access to services, but that you can also share with your facilities. We recently developed a toolkit on the role of the advocates, as we're talking about, ensuring that, all these all of those participating in a forensic exam know your role. These are really good tools to kind of understand and to keep, in mind. Matthew?
Yeah. Yeah, no, and there are answers to, as Juliana was saying, answers to lots of questions at JDI and CALCASA's website. And Juliana did mention the Prea Resource Center. That is a tool, that's a place and a resource that we ourselves often turn to for clarification and insight about what is a pretty complicated law with 52 standards. And previously, as part of this project, we have developed some other trainings that might be relevant here, which we will be sharing some links with. I'm copy pasting right now into the chat box some of the links for the relevant trainings, but they will also be emailed out by Juliana as part of the kind of follow-up for this webinar. And we do welcome the opportunity to answer any direct questions. It seems like there might be some coming up here.
So to answer the second question that we have here, specific about writing an ROI that's open to sharing with another agency, this can be really difficult to be fully VAWA compliant on it, because you're right. Sometimes we don't know what agency someone's going to be transferred to. A way to get around this is by writing that person. So if they do get transferred, writing them, if you have their permission to write them, writing them with that release of information that they can fill out and send back to you. And that's if you're going to be as strict as possible about that ROI. If you're open to receiving verbal consent, if they can call your hotline and give verbal consent that way, once they know the specific facility that they're going to be transferred to. But you're right, it is hard to really be as VAWA compliant as we normally are with folks in the community, just because it's a lot harder to get that in-person release signed, especially when people are being transferred all the time. We know that folks in state facilities and in larger jail systems are constantly being transferred. So this can be a challenge that we have to work through. I hope that answers your question. It also looks like we got a question specific about using an answering service for hotline. So in California, it's set up a little bit differently, but that is a challenge if folks do have an answering service that calls the folks after. And I think, does anyone else have any ideas on how they can get that information? Because you're right, you can't call back. You can't make a call back to someone. So what we have done here is it's more of a direct transfer, but I don't know if that's possible to change that at your center.
Yeah, I know that for some of our rape crisis centers that, have the system set up where, it's called to a hotline, that they recognize or they identified a number that is going to be available to someone within the agency to respond and be able to provide that crisis intervention without having to call the system. And then after a certain time, it is redirected to the hotline so that there's at least some sort of crisis intervention, right? So it really comes to that sustainability aspect of bringing in the training into your entire agency and ensuring that everyone has some basic understanding of what services you're available to provide. And again, a lot of these advocates who are responding to these crisis calls have your basic training on trauma-informed and crisis intervention. So they should be able to have that, to provide that. And it's just necessary for you to really share those additional steps that might identify someone who's calling from a facility. Most of the time, it does tell you that they're calling from a facility, so it makes it easier to identify. So they should be able to kind of get that information for you. But it's really within how you're going to train your staff or how you're going to relate the message within your own facility and your own agency.
And I think also trying to be as mindful as possible that it needs to be communicated with the facility, because they have workarounds within their phone system. So if you're finding that calls are dropping, and there's patterns like that, that's something that can be addressed with your contacts at the facility. They can contact their phone company and try to work around that, or even try to have a different dial out to get to you. I know a lot of rape crisis centers have done that. But it's really reliant on having a strong relationship with the facility, which can be hard to do.
Yeah.
But I think, again, not just thinking about phone calls, but thinking about letter writing and trying to enhance that, because almost all incarcerated survivors do have access to letter writing, even if they don't have access to the phone. So really trying to make sure you're bolstering up ongoing emotional support via letter, as that's what most folks have consistent access to.
Yeah. And as you're building these relationships with your facilities, one of the things that, you know, you can keep in mind as well is that, you know, and empower the survivors to ask if they can utilize other spaces, so that you ensure that you have that consistency and that you're not worried that the call is going to be dropped or lost in the, you know, in the process. But of course, this is, you know, with that strong relationship that you're building with them, and with the understanding, you know, and hope that the survivor knows that that's accessible to them as well.
Yeah, I think that we've come to expect that this is just everything's a process. It's just not a shopping list that we can cross things off of. It comes down to time, minutes spent, hours spent sometimes, you know, really kind of getting to know and partner with your corresponding staff at the facilities, folks who are going to be working with you not only in emergency situations, but day to day, to make sure that access is unimpeded.
Absolutely, yeah. Building a relationship with the facility is easier said than done. It takes a lot of work from the advocate and the rape crisis center to ensure that there's a consistent communication with them. And sometimes that communication can be one-ended, right? It could be that it just happens from your end and it doesn't happen from them. But we always encourage you also to not only focus on one individual in the facility. Sometimes your PCM might not be that contact, right? Sometimes it might be someone else. It might be your community resource representative. It could be you're the associate warden. So, you know, definitely keep a list of contacts and not focus on one individual, because just like Karen just mentioned right now, the big frustration, it is staff turnover, right? There's a constant movement with staff as well, not only when it comes to inmates being transferred, but staff constantly is also moving around to different places. So then with that foundation and that relationship that you build with that one person goes away when they leave. So that's why we encourage that you build that with more than just one person.
Do folks have other questions that we can get to at this point? Specifically, perhaps on forensic exam accompaniment and that process there? And Lauren, I do want to just highlight what you're saying, that sometimes there does need to be a sense of like calling folks out when they're really doing something that's not okay. If you have, you know, if an audit is coming up, really trying to be as honest as possible during that audit, so that, you know, the truth is getting out there. That's a tool you can use, using if you have like OIG office, something like that. Sometimes you have to go above a facility and maybe go to the statewide Prea coordinator. So there's a lot of different ways to kind of get around it if your slow relationship building isn't going the way that you need it to. Sometimes you have to go above people or around people, and it's incredibly frustrating. But other questions that we can answer for you while we still have some time on this webinar? I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. We see that retaliation is very real for our survivors. And it's really important that whatever advocacy you're doing on behalf of a survivor or within a facility, knowing that it might reflect back on the folks within that facility. So being as transparent as possible with all the survivors you're working with around that, so that they can really decide if it's something that they're comfortable with or not.
And there had been a question asked up towards the beginning of the webinar. I think it was Jacqueline. Pardon me if I'm moving you to Oregon and you're not in Oregon, Jacqueline, but the question had to do with the fact that Oregon law requires that an advocate is called for a forensic exam, whereas the Prea federal law is it says that they shall attempt to make it available, but it falls short of an ironclad requirement. I've checked with one of my colleagues here at JDI who sees that as actually a pretty strong pairing, and that as always, we of state and federal requirements, so that it seems like the state law would obviously still be in effect there and not undermined at all by the vagueness of Prea. So in Oregon, yes, they have to call. That's another tool that you as an advocate can use when you're introducing yourself or beginning conversations with agencies. You can make sure that they're aware of that, and that it obviously is the best practice for your agencies to be in good contact and good collaboration before that kind of emergency circumstance. Yeah.
And I just wanted to say also that, because I'm going back on some of the previous chats and some of the questions, and I wanted to highlight something that Lauren said, that is actually super, super important to kind of keep in mind, as we know that every survivor is completely different, right? Lauren shared that, there was an incident where, she had to go sort of against a lot of the training that she's had, right? And sort of the experiences that she's had, and that the key to her being able to provide successful advocacy during that time was to ensure that, she kept all of the needs of the survivor in mind. So in forensic exams, sometimes that's going to happen, or most of the time that's going to happen, where you're going to have to go against everything that you've been trained, and really just like the scenarios that we had, focus on the survivor and really ensure that you're listening to what the survivor is sharing with you and what the survivor is telling you, so that is going to help you with that report that you're building, to ensure that there's follow-up services, but also to ensure that the message is related to the facility, right? And so that survivors are saying, those that feel comfortable, that the advocacy that is being provided is provided and, within the role and within your capacity, that's going to trickle down to all inmates that are at the facilities. And sometimes that trickles down even to staff, right? Where they know, like, they stay within the scope of their role and they were able to provide advocacy in the most professional way as possible, and ensuring that they're responding to the specific needs of that survivor, and that it wasn't, something that they took all of the previous conversations or things happening around them into mind. So thank you for saying that, Lauren, because I know that it's one of the things that it's very difficult for a lot of us as advocates, right? That we have to go against everything that we know, and that we feel that it's the right thing to do step by step. But in order to ensure that we're there for the survivor, that's also very important. These are all great comments and thoughts as we're wrapping it up. Are there any final questions? I know we're going to reach out and send some follow-up emails and reach out to a lot of you to ensure that we can provide you that one-on-one conversation as well. Again, this webinar was very much focused on the role of the advocate during a forensic exam. Excuse me, we wanted to allow some conversation and some space to ensure that all of you who were part of the webinar today really had an opportunity to process some of the procedures that most likely happen when you are providing advocacy during a forensic exam. It's mostly related to how you respond and the things that you can do to ensure that there's that continuous support for survivors who are incarcerated, who are receiving, who are, going for a forensic exam. We know how traumatic that is and how intrusive that is. So the more that you as an advocate become prepared for these challenging conversations and these challenging moments, the more that you're going to ensure that it's all very much survivor-centered in a very trauma-informed way. Matthew and Kris, are there any final things that you would like to add as we're kind of wrapping it up? It seems like the comments are kind of slowing down a little bit. Again, we're going to follow up with some other stuff.
Yeah, I would just say, we always, again, like we are very grateful and humbled that you joined us today. We want to make sure that all of the trainings we provide are really useful to you advocates who are doing this difficult work in the field. So if there's anything that you'd like to let us know, we have created an evaluation form with it doesn't take long to fill out, and there are some sections where you can just write your comments. And we would appreciate it if you would do that. Thanks a lot. The link is in the chat box. And yeah, we're here to support you at any time. You can reach us at advocate@justdetention.org or Prea@CALCASA.org. We're really always happy to hear from you. And often, if we don't know the answer, it's an opportunity for us to learn the answer. So the training goes both ways. We really appreciate it.
It does. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. We really want to continue the conversation. Really, this is just the start of a conversation. We can sit here and have, very lengthy ones on specific topics and comments that you all have brought up to our attention. So thank you so much for just being part of this webinar and the conversation. We will look forward to following up with most of you and ensuring that we continue these conversations. Again, connect with each other as well. One of the most valuable tools that we've learned to have is the connection and collaboration with other rape crisis centers or other agencies who probably or most likely have experienced a similar challenge or a similar situation that you've had, and connecting with them definitely allows for space to ensure that we are all very consistent in providing support and services to incarcerated survivors, which is what at the end of the day we are here for, to ensure that these services are accessible for all survivors, including those in detention settings. Thank you so much for being here today with us. Again, this webinar is recorded and will be uploaded to the CALCASA site, attached with all of the documents that were mentioned in the webinar. If you have any questions, feel free to call us. We are always available and love to talk more about being able to provide services to those who are in detention settings. Kris and Matthew, any last words before we close it up?
No, just thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. Have a great day, everyone.